Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a world of chaos, conflict, and power with one of history's greatest minds as our guide.
We're looking at the complex, really volatile history of North Africa.
And we're using Ibn-e-Khaldun's own life and his own work as a roadmap. You've brought us a true historical monolith.
It really is. This is Volume 6, specifically parts 11 and 12 of his legendary work, Kitab al-Ibar,
which translates to the Book of Lessons. And it feels like a very appropriate title for what we're about to discuss.
I'd say so, because it's so much more than just a history book. It's almost like a living document of a civilization that was in just a state of perpetual conflict.
And this volume is the raw data, isn't it? It's the specific, granular historical information that Khaldun himself used to build his famous philosophical framework.
Exactly. His whole theory of how states rise and why they inevitably collapse. It all comes from the events we're going to talk about today.
So this deep dive is really designed to be a shortcut for you, the listener, into this world of, well, shifting sand and shifting loyalties.
That's a great way to put it.
We're covering the Muslim states that stretched all across North Africa, what was known as Ifriqiya in the east, and the Maghreb in the west.
And their constant draining involvement with Al-Andalus, just across the strait.
And this isn't just going to be about dates and battles. We want to get into the mechanisms of power in an era that was just defined by instability.
Right. Our mission here is to move past the broad strokes.
Yeah.
We're going to dissect a region that was really dominated by two major, constantly warring forces.
Okay, what are they?
First, you have the powerful, highly mobile, nomadic Arab tribes. They are our kinetic, destabilizing element in this whole story.
The wild card.
The ultimate wild card. And second, you have the great Berber Dynasties, who were in this constant struggle to try and consolidate some kind of centralized power.
So we want to trace the specific players, understand the logic of their conflicts, and then, ultimately reveal the political patterns that Khaldun himself identified.
That's the plan. Operationally, we're going to start by tracing the influence of these seismic forces, especially the Banu Hilal migration.
And we're focusing on two tribes in particular.
The Riyah and the Zagba. They were, and this is not an exaggeration, the kingmakers and the kingbreakers of the entire region.
Wow.
Then we'll shift our focus to the Berber power struggle, the Zenata Berbers, to be specific.
And that's the epic clash between the Marinids of Fez, the Banu Marin.
And the Zayanids of Tlemcen, the Banu Zayan. This whole drama, this entire chaotic theater, is the foundation for understanding Khaldun's revolutionary ideas about historical cycles.
So let's unpack this turbulent historical canvas. Where do we begin?
We have to start right where the source material anchors us.
Yeah.
With the Arab tribes and how their arrival just fundamentally shattered the existing political map of the Maghreb.
Okay, let's do it. Part 11 sets the stage by introducing the Muntasirun Arabs. Now, who were these people? They weren't just random nomads, were they?
Not at all. Khaldun is very clear about this. These were tribes whose history was already deeply woven into the tapestry of early Islamic expansion. They've been utilized in Egypt, in the Near East.
So they were known quantities.
Very known quantities. He emphasizes that these were not just groups of people, they were powerful, seasoned military confederations. Their presence in the Maghreb wasn't an accident.
It was a deliberate act, though.
Oh, absolutely. A deliberate, though, as it turns out, a ultimately ruinous act of political engineering.
By whom?
They were often moved west by the Fatimids in Egypt, used as military tools. Their arrival was part of a broader political strategy, sometimes to punish rivals, other times to maybe reinforce a frontier.
But the real historical trauma, the event that just permanently alters North Africa, is this massive migration of the Banu Hilal and the Banu Salam. We hear it called the Hilalian invasion. What does Khaldun's account tell us about the sheer scale of this?
It was revolutionary in every single sense of the word, politically, demographically, economically. Khaldun stresses that their arrival in Ifriqiya and the Maghreb wasn't an absorption, it was a deluge.
A deluge.
Yes. These tribes acted as this continuous destructive wave that just destabilized the existing sedentary political structures.
Like the Zirid state, the Banu Hamed.
Exactly. Forcing them into ruin or forcing them to retreat into these coastal fortresses. The sheer volume of this influx meant they completely displaced or subjugated the settled populations and even the semi-nomadic Berber populations that were already there.
You said they were destructive because they were nomadic. That seems to be a really crucial feature in Khaldun's analysis, doesn't it?
It's the central feature.
They weren't interested in becoming city builders or setting up fixed capitals like the dynasties before them.
Precisely. Khaldun details this over and over again. Their strength came from their mobility. They were perpetually on the move, engaged in constant small-scale wars, which kept their military solidarity, their Asabiyyah, extremely high.
A concept we'll definitely circle back to.
We will. They possessed what Khaldun called badawa, the roughness, the hardiness of the desert life. And what that meant, practically, is that they had no fixed infrastructure to defend, but they had the military capability to destroy anyone else's.
And the power of this huge nomadic wave is really distilled into two key tribes, the heavyweights, Khaldun names, the Rhea and the Zagba.
The two big players.
So if these tribes were determining the fate of empires, how exactly did the Rhea, for instance, leverage their dominance?
The Riyar were probably the most politically savvy of all the nomadic groups. Khaldun spends a significant amount of space just tracing their history and their constantly shifting relationships with the established powers.
Like the Banu Hamid and later the Almohads.
Right, the Almohads who governed the entire region before this Mernid-Zayyanid split we're talking about. The Riyar operated from a position of absolute military necessity.
What do you mean by that?
Well, they didn't need the Sultan to survive, but the Sultan desperately needed them.
Ah, okay. So they didn't try to found their own state, but they fundamentally controlled the mechanisms of the states around them.
That's it, exactly. They were more than mercenaries. They were an autonomous political layer, just imposed right on top of the established order.
So what did that look like in practice? You mentioned tribute. What kind of tribute did they demand?
Khaldun outlines these specific operational dynamics. They were after three things: tribute, territory, and control over taxation.
Okay, let's break that down. Tribute wasn't just gold, I'm guessing.
No, not at all. It was often the right to control vast, fertile grazing lands, which of course displaced agricultural populations, and that, in turn, reduced the tax base for the settled ruler.
So it's a vicious cycle.
A very vicious cycle. And, more critically, they often demanded the right to control major taxation points, road tolls, market taxes, even parts of the customs duties in specific cities.
Wow. So if the central government is, say, the Marinid Sultan in Fez, the Rhea could be skimming right off the top of the Sultan's revenue stream before it even gets to the capital.
Exactly. Functionally strangling the state's ability to pay for its own bureaucracy and its own standing army.
It's genius, in a way.
It is. And Khaldun's history is just littered with examples. He mentions figures like Masud ibn Zuadi and Dawood ibn Suleiman and the powerful Banu Amer branch of the Riyan.
These men weren't crowned kings then.
No, but the sultans often granted them the title of sheikh or leader or even emir prince. They were acknowledging their practical sovereignty over huge swaths of territory.
So they were kingmakers, like you said.
Kingmakers, yes, but often destroyers of the treasury. If a sultan tried to consolidate power or, say, cut their pay, the Rhea would just switch allegiance. Or even worse, they'd turn their immense military strength directly against the sultan.
That makes their power mechanism so much clearer. So if the Rhea were the masters of leveraging their military service for economic control, who were the Zagba tribe in relation to them? Were they competitors?
Yeah.
Collaborators?
Primarily, they were fierce competitors who would sometimes, enter into pragmatic alliances when it suited them.
But mostly rivals.
Mostly rivals. Khaldun describes the Zagba, and he details the lineage of their leaders, like Hussein ibn Zag, as the other dominant branch of this Hilaline confederation. They were just as nomadic, just as strong, and just as disruptive.
And the source material really highlights the constant internal conflict between the Zagba and the Rhea. How did that intertribal rivalry play into the overall political chaos of the Maghreb?
It was really a double-edged sword for the established dynasties.
How so?
Well, on one hand, their fighting meant the Arab power base was never truly unified enough to establish its own singular state over the whole region.
Which is good for the sultans, I guess.
In a way. But on the other hand, it guaranteed constant instability. So if the Zayyanid Sultan of Tlemcen managed to secure the allegiance of the Rhea, he immediately faced the threat of the Zagba, allying with his rival, the Marinid Sultan of Fez.
So it sounds like no matter which Berber dynasty was nominally in charge, they were just perpetually caught in this tribal crossfire.
They were. And it ensured that centralized authority was always temporary and always highly conditional.
Khaldun shows this beautifully, doesn't he?
He does. The constant movement, the sheer numbers, the inherent military hardiness of these nomadic tribes. It all meant the total, long-lasting consolidation of power, the kind you need to build real infrastructure and institutions, was just impossible.
Their very existence forced the settled states to spend all their resources just trying to appease them.
An unsustainable percentage of their resources on military appeasement and defense. And that ultimately drained their economic and their political asabiyyah. The Arab tribes were the chaotic, unpredictable force, perpetually tearing up the map.
That leads us perfectly into the Berber heartland, the people who are actually trying to build those centralized states.
Right.
So if the Arab tribes were the destructive, chaotic force, Section 2 is all about the dynastic struggles, particularly the rivalry in the western and central Maghreb. And this comes from the Zenata Confederation.
Yeah, so here we transition to the great state builders of the era, or maybe the great state aspirants is a better term.
Yeah.
The Zenata Berbers were one of the major blocs, known historically for their toughness and their incredible skill in cavalry warfare. Khaldun details their long history of founding states, and in this period, they are the main protagonists fighting for control.
And the specific branches of the Zenata who hold center stage in Volume 6 are the Banu Marin, the Marinids, and the Banu Zayan, the Zayanids.
This is the key dynastic boxing match we really need to understand.
Okay, so let's start with the Zayanids, the rulers of Tlemcen. Where does Khaldun place their strategic importance?
Tlemcen was geographically and politically crucial, but its centrality was also its curse.
How so?
The Zayanid state sat right in the middle. It functioned as this necessary but perpetually besieged buffer state. Khaldun explains that Tlemcen was the perennial battlefield between the great, ambitious Marinids rising from the west in Fez.
And the powerful established Hafsids in the east, centered in Tunis.
Exactly.
A political buffer sounds safe, but in reality it just meant they were being targeted by both sides constantly.
All the time. And this constant pressure, it just fostered this inherent dynastic chaos. Khaldun's history of the Zayanids is one long chronicle of defending their state, losing it, and then reclaiming it. They were always on the verge of collapse.
So they're rulers, like the sons of Sultan Abu Tashufin.
Though Khaldun later served, interestingly enough.
Right. They were constantly losing control to Marinid sieges, only to get it back when the Marinids had their own internal revolts.
It's this cycle. Their entire political existence was defined by external threat, which forced them to rely heavily on those same local Arab tribes for survival, which further weakened their ability to centralize.
So if Tlemcen was constantly fighting for survival, the Marinids of Fez were the aggressive, dynamic force in this equation.
They were the aggressors, yes.
What was the defining ambition of the Banu Marin, according to the source?
Unification. Khaldun establishes this very clearly. The core Marinid ambition was nothing less than uniting the entire Maghreb, the Far, the Central, and the Eastern all under one banner. They wanted to restore the glory of the earlier Almohad or Almoravid empires.
They represented a high point of that Asabiyyah, didn't they?
They did. They had just recently emerged from the periphery to overthrow the older, declining powers. They had that raw energy.
And their rulers, like Sultan Abu al-Hassan and his son Sultan Abu Inan, they're portrayed as incredibly aggressive military leaders. Where did they direct most of that kinetic energy?
Oh, everywhere. Tlemcen was the perennial target, often besieged for years at a time. But their ambition went so much further east.
Towards the Hafsids.
Deep into Ifriqiya. Khaldun details their massive military campaigns aimed at toppling the Hafsids in Tunis. They weren't just seeking tribute. They wanted regime change, complete political absorption.
The fact that they were willing to march armies across the entire breadth of North Africa really shows the height of their ambition.
And, perhaps, the tragic flaw of imperial overreach.
You've mentioned the Hafsids a few times. Now, while Volume 6 focuses more on the Marinid-Zayanid conflict, the Hafsids in Ifriqiya are this constant counterforce. What role do they play in this unstable triangle?
They are the anchor of stability in the east. They're the third corner of the triangle. They had the largest and richest major city, Tunis, and they controlled the critical eastern trade routes.
So their history in this volume is mostly defensive.
Mostly, yes. It's defined by their defense against Marinid expansion. And crucially, Khaldun documents that their survival, just like the Zayanids, depended on their skill in managing the Arab wildcard.
How so? What was their strategy?
They were masters of using the local Arab tribes. They played the Rio against the Zaba, or they'd secure their service through exorbitant payments.
Using them as a buffer.
A human buffer against the Marinid armies marching from the west. For the Hafsids, the Arab tribes were less a source of mercenary strength and more a necessary, very expensive, and deeply unreliable defense mechanism.
They were buying time.
Buying time and security with cash and land grants. It just illustrates again that real political power lay in the ability to mobilize autonomous military force, not in bureaucratic centralization.
Okay, so if the Hafsids, Marinids, and Zionids form this fragile geopolitical triangle, then Section 3 is where we really watch that triangle shatter repeatedly.
Yes.
And it often seems to happen over the fate of one critical city, Clemson. This is the theater of war where instability just became a permanent condition.
And Khaldun's account of the sieges is gripping because it's so repetitive.
Yeah.
It's not a bug, it's a feature. It shows that political turnover was not an anomaly, it was the mechanism of governance itself.
And nothing exemplifies this kinetic, grinding conflict more than the relentless Marinid assault on Clemson.
Absolutely nothing.
I want to focus on the reality of these sieges. That this wasn't just a skirmish outside the walls. These were long, grinding operations. What details does Khaldun provide about the intensity of it?
He provides some pretty grim details. For example, the siege conducted by Sultan Abu al-Hasan, it lasted for years. It resulted in a full occupation and the brief total collapse of the Zionid dynasty.
Yeah.
Years. These weren't temporary blockades. They involved constructing dedicated siege camps, complex logistical networks to supply the Marinid army for months or even years. They employed professional military commanders.
So Tlemcen became the symbol of the Maghreb's political viability.
It did. Whoever held Tlemcen claimed control of the central Maghreb, and with it, the legitimacy of the larger Zenata state.
And the source material highlights this professionalization of warfare during that era. It mentions specific viziers, specific military commanders. What does that tell us about the nature of these dynastic struggles?
It tells us the stakes were incredibly high, and the sultans were moving beyond relying solely on, tribal levies. They employed professional staff who managed logistics, who administered the supply chains for siege engines, who negotiated the complex pay structures for the supporting Arab contingents.
Which requires a sophisticated treasury and administration.
The very institutions that were constantly being starved by the demands of the nomadic tribes. It was this race between professional statecraft and decentralized tribal power.
A race the state often lost.
Very often.
Now let's turn to the zenith of this whole struggle. Sultan Abu al-Hasan's great campaigns. You mentioned his ambition wasn't just Clemson, it was the East. Khaldun meticulously recounts his massive thrust into Ifriqiya. Can you walk us through that conquest?
It was a truly monumental undertaking. We're in the 1340s, and Abu al-Hasan manages to raise an army that is massive enough and loyal enough, for a time anyway, to cross the entire Maghreb.
An incredible feat of logistics.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And he succeeds. He defeats the Hafsids, he enters Tunis, and he briefly installs a Marinid governor. He effectively unites the entire North African strip, from the Atlantic all the way to Tripoli, under the Marinid banner.
This was it, the realization of the Marinid dream, the reestablishment of a unified Maghrebi empire.
It was their moment of ultimate triumph.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because Khaldun's big insight is that this kind of imperial overreach isn't just costly, it's often fatal. What happens almost immediately after Abu al-Hasan's victory?
The centrifugal forces of the Maghreb just immediately take over. The conquest itself destabilized the Hafsid realm, but the subsequent strain on the Marinid system was just unbearable.
The system started to crack.
It shattered. Khaldun describes how, on his return journey from Tunis, facing the desert and mountain regions, the revolt started. And it wasn't just among the conquered Hafsid populations. It was among his own Berber and, crucially, his Arab troops.
So what was the catalyst for this internal Marinid collapse? Was it just weariness from the campaign, or was there specific political treachery involved?
It was both, but Khaldun emphasizes the political mechanism. The distance and the cost of the campaign created an opportunity for internal rivals.
His own sons.
His own sons, most famously Sultan Abu Inan, who seized the moment. They saw their father's armies depleted and his attention focused thousands of miles away. They launched a revolt back in the Far Maghreb, seizing the capital, Fez, and cutting off Abu al-Hasan's lifeline.
And Khaldun documents specific defections, doesn't he?
He does. Khiznat factions and various branches of the Riyad tribe, they saw the writing on the wall. They abandoned the exhausted sultan and threw their weight behind the new, rising power, Abu Inan.
That sounds like instant political dissolution. The Sultan achieves the ultimate victory, and moments later, he's a desperate refugee in the mountains trying to fight his way back to his own capital.
That is the absolute essence of Khaldun's lesson here. The loyalty of the powerful Arab tribes, even the subordinate Berber clans, it was tied only to immediate success and immediate bounty.
Nothing else mattered.
Nothing. When Abu al-Hasan's supply lines stretched thin and his focus moved east, the opportunity arose for a new, energetic leader, his son, to claim the still high Asabiyyah of the core Marinid state. Imperial overreach, Khaldun argues, creates the vacuum for civil war.
And the aftermath of this massive collapse is so telling. The chaos allows the Zayyanids, who were barely holding on in Tlemcen, to push out the weakened Marinid garrison and reclaim their state.
And the Hafsids, who had just been overthrown in Tunis, they immediately seize the opportunity to regain control.
It's the political rubber band effect in full force.
That's a perfect way to describe it. Abu al-Hassan pushed the political elasticity of the Maghreb to its breaking point. And when it snapped back, it just restored the status quo. 3 fragmented dynastic states, perpetually fighting, all highly dependent on volatile tribal support. No single dynasty could sustain control over that vast territory.
But the conflict wasn't just internal to the Maghreb. This whole volatile system was constantly being influenced by the affairs of Al-Andalus, the Muslim kingdoms across the Strait of Gibraltar.
A constant drain.
How did the Iberian Peninsula act as a resource drain on these North African dynasties?
Well, Khaldun makes it very clear that the rulers of the Maghreb, particularly the Marinids, were just inextricably linked to Al-Andalus.
Through shared religion and strategic proximity.
Yes. They were constantly being pulled into the conflicts of the Iberian Peninsula, primarily to offer military aid to the beleaguered Nasrid Kingdom of Granada.
And this wasn't altruism, I take it. It was strategic.
Purely strategic. Maintaining Muslim control of Granada kept the powerful Christian kingdoms of Castile and Aragon off African shores.
So the Marinids weren't just supplying a few thousand troops here and there. They were diverting critical military resources and financial capital across the strait.
Big time.
Can you give us an example from the source material of how this diversion weakened their internal position?
Absolutely. The Marinids frequently had to engage in these large-scale operations across the strait. They'd mobilize entire fleets and armies for the defense of critical points, like the approaches to Gibraltar.
So that meant thousands of their best troops, vast quantities of gold, and their critical command structures were all tied up fighting in Spain.
Exactly. When they should have been consolidating control over the newly acquired central Maghreb like Tlemcen.
So in effect, if Sultan Abu al-Sassan diverted a significant portion of his Zenata cavalry and his Arab allies, say, a strong contingent of the Banu Amr to fight in Spain, he simultaneously weakened the military force he needed to hold a rebellious city like Tlemcen or defend against his own ambitious sons back in Fez.
Precisely. Khaldun documents this cyclical strain perfectly. The intercontinental struggle drained the financial and military reserves that were desperately needed for internal political stability.
And the key coastal cities like Ceuta and Tangier.
They became less centers of local governance and more just vital logistical hubs, permanent launching pads for military operations, which just underscores the continuous military-first focus of the entire era. The political turnover rate was so high because the Marinids were constantly overextending themselves on 2 continents at the same time.
We've spent this time charting these grand dynastic struggles, but what makes Volume 6 so unique, so powerful, is that the history isn't written from some detached academic distance.
No, not at all.
Section 4 brings us to Ibn Khaldun himself. The author was an active participant in all this chaos.
And that's the intellectual gold in this volume. We really have to fully absorb the fact that Ibn Khaldun was not just a historian. He was a diplomat, a minister, a vizier, and yes, sometimes a prisoner in the very courts he meticulously describes.
His life story is the ultimate personal reflection of the political instability he analyzed.
It truly is.
He served under the Marinids and the Zayyanids. He swapped allegiance as frequently as the Banu Hilal tribes did. The sources document his service under Marinid sultans like Abu Inan.
But also his subsequent fluctuating status,
Right.
which often led to flight or disgrace or temporary incarceration.
What does this tell us about the political environment for anyone holding power, even intellectual power, during this era?
It tells us that court politics was a death sport. Being a vizier or a minister was probably the most dangerous job in North Africa.
You were literally betting your life on who would win the next skirmish outside the city wall.
You were. Khaldun wasn't just observing the political system, he was a crucial cog within it. He was required to perform sensitive diplomatic maneuverings, negotiate with potentially rebellious tribes, manage the Sultan's treasury, and when power shifted, as it constantly did, you were either elevated to these dizzying heights or you were thrown into a dungeon.
Can you just imagine the fear, the diplomatic tightrope he must have been walking, writing these sensitive historical accounts of his patrons and their rivals while constantly looking over his shoulder?
And his autobiography, which is threaded all through the Kitab al-Abar, it reveals the intensely political patronage of history writing itself. He often wrote sections of this work while he was in the service of rival rulers.
For example.
For example, he documented his relationship and his interaction with the sons of Sultan Abu Tashufin of Tlemcen, the very Zayanids who were constantly fighting the Marinids.
So he was writing the history of the enemy while working for the current government.
He was. It demands an incredible level of political dexterity. His source materials weren't libraries. They were immediate court-based documents, highly sensitive state secrets.
Which gives the history a stunning level of detail.
It does, but it also reflects the political necessities of his survival. He had to be impartial in his observation, yet constantly loyal to his current employer.
His necessity for constant movement perfectly illustrates the instability he wrote about.
Perfectly. The sources detail his recorded travels, his changes in allegiance, from Fez, the Marinid capital, to Tlemcen, the Zayanid capital, to Granada as an Andalusian refuge, and then eventually his final emigration to Cairo. He physically moved across the entire political landscape because stability was a fiction.
So Khaldun wasn't just theorizing about political philosophy from a quiet study somewhere. He was living this material.
He was living it every day. He experienced the sheer military weight of the nomadic tribes, he felt the fragility of the Zenata empires, and he saw firsthand why authority could never be sustained.
His personal life just validates the core claim of his entire historical analysis.
It does. That power was fluid, it was momentary, and it was utterly dependent on the immediate strength and location of whoever the currently ascendant strongman or tribe happened to be.
And that leads us to the crucial intellectual core of Volume 6, doesn't it? The detailed history he lived through and chronicled, it formed the empirical basis for his great social theory.
It's the foundation of everything. We need to look closely at how he framed this world in his text. Which brings us to Section 5, the geography and ethnography of the Maghreb, which really highlights the sociological approach that makes Khaldun so unique.
Khaldun was so systematic. He was classifying populations and explicitly linking their way of life to their political capacity. He discusses the diverse populations, the settled city dwellers, the nomadic tribes, the Berbers, the Arabs. What's the fundamental distinction he draws between the sedentary lifestyle and the nomadic or Badawa lifestyle?
He draws a fundamental, almost anthropological distinction. The settled life, what he calls Hadara, which is centered in cities like Fez or Tunis, it creates advanced civilization. You get sophisticated bureaucracies, arts, refined living.
But there's a downside.
A major one. Khaldun argues that this very comfort leads to a lack of military hardiness. It softens their collective strength. They become reliant on fixed institutions and on paid armies.
And conversely, the nomadic lifestyle.
The Badawi of the mountains and deserts, where tribes like the Rio and the Marinids in their early days lived, it forced mutual dependence. It forced constant vigilance and preparedness for war.
So it breeds a different kind of person.
A different kind of group. Khaldun explicitly links this harsh, self-reliant existence to the cultivation of what he calls noble traits: courage, fierce loyalty, self-sufficiency. This lifestyle produces a collective strength Asabiyyah group solidarity that is robust enough to seize power.
And this is the aha moment for the listener, right? The realization that Volume 6 is essentially a massive, detailed, historical proof point for the Asabiyyah cycle. The history itself is the evidence.
It is the evidence.
So how does the rise and fall of the Zenata dynasties, the Marinids, and the Zayanids illustrate this decay?
Oh, it's textbook Khaldun. The Marinids, for example. They emerged from the periphery, from the rough Zenata mountains, bringing this high Asabiyyah, this incredible military energy. That's what allowed them to conquer the older, decaying Almohad Empire.
But then what happens?
Then they settle in the luxurious, sophisticated city of Fez, and their Asabiyyah immediately begins to soften and decay. Their reliance on external, paid mercenaries like the Rio tribes to fight their wars is the key evidence of this decay.
So the very act of establishing a stable, civilized state is the first step toward its eventual demise.
Because centralized power inherently erodes the rugged solidarity that founded it.
And the nomadic Arab tribes, the Riyah and Zagaba, they just perpetually maintained this high Asabiyyah out in the desert.
That's why their power was so relentless. They never settled, so their Asabiyyah never decayed. They were a perpetually renewed military threat, ready to be leveraged by any rising power.
Khaldun argues that the desert tribes possess the inherent strength of their environment,
while the settled cities possess the inherent weakness of theirs. And this cyclical nature of power, where a vigorous tribe conquers a soft empire only to become soft itself, is illustrated over and over and over in the history of the Marinids losing control to internal dissent or external Arab pressure.
We also need to appreciate the geography that reinforced this whole pattern. Khaldun's descriptions aren't just place names, they're political barriers.
That's a great point. He systematically details the three major regions: Ifriqiya, the Central Maghreb, and the Far Maghreb.
And how did that geography dictate the political reality?
Khaldun details how the geography basically dictated the impossibility of permanent unification. The vast separation enforced by mountain ranges, by valleys, by coastal plains, it reinforced distinct regional power centers. The distances were just too great, and the lines of communication too fragile for a central power in Fez to maintain tight, loyal control over Tunis.
Which brings us back to Tlemcen. The Central Maghreb became perpetually contested because it was the choke point.
It was the geographic nexus where these three distinct regional spheres of power: Fez, Tunis, and the nomadic heartland all overlapped.
It was the necessary bridge, but also the point of greatest vulnerability.
Exactly. The mountains and deserts didn't just host the wildcard nomadic tribes. They were fundamental political barriers that prevented any single centralized authority from achieving lasting continental domination. The land itself dictated that political instability would be the rule, not the exception,
Which makes Volume 6 less a history of successful dynasties.
and more a chronicle of continuous fragmented struggle.
So, after all that, what does this all mean for us? We've taken this deep dive into Volume 6 of Kitab al-Abar. We've dissected the chaos of the Maghreb's political landscape, the power of the nomadic tribes, the tragedy of dynastic overreach. What's the takeaway?
I think the overarching synthesis is that Volume 6 is just a masterclass in the complexity of power during this era. It details this relentless kinetic energy between the Berber dynastic aspirants, who were all seeking centralization, and the powerful nomadic Arab tribes, who represented decentralized military might.
And Khaldun's work proves that the source of political power was never static.
Never. Power was perpetually earned and lost, and not through fixed laws of succession, but entirely on the battlefield, dependent on retaining the fragile loyalties of key tribal leaders like the Riyak and the Zagba.
Right. If you lost their support, your empire, no matter how vast as Sultan Abu al-Hasan learned after his grand conquest of Tunis, could just dissolve into civil war overnight.
And this history is the clearest demonstration of how deeply interwoven individual destiny and grand historical forces can be. Khaldun was a mister and a captive, constantly moving between these warring courts. He was forced to serve the very forces of cyclical power and instability that he would later define in his theoretical work.
He didn't just read about Asabiyyah, he was forced to flee from its consequences.
He was. It paints this picture of a world where centralized bureaucracy was merely an aspiration, constantly thwarted by the reality of military power held by these autonomous, decentralized forces.
So what's the final thought we should leave the listener with?
The final provocative thought we draw from this immense source is this: Khaldun documented a world where the primary focus of kings and sultans was not infrastructure or fixed borders or administration. It was the sheer ability to mobilize and retain powerful, autonomous tribal forces. This instability, though destructive to settled life, was the very mechanism that generated political history.
Wow.
And when Khaldun finally gave up on the Maghreb and fled to the ultimate stability of Mamluk Cairo, he confirmed the grim reality demonstrated throughout Volume 6. In that time and place, mobility and military solidarity trumped statecraft, forcing even the greatest thinker of his age to choose flight over fight. And this wasn't merely a personal choice, it was the final desperate political act of his era.